Welcome, welcome, welcome to our English-speaking union happy hour, writing wild women poets, ramblers, and mavericks who shape how we see the natural world with Kathryn Aalto. Today's happy hour is sponsored by the Monmouth County branch of the ESU, who arranged this program. As ideas for these lectures come from you, our members and viewers, please share any ideas or topics for an upcoming speaker or talk using the survey that will appear at the end of our program tonight. Before we get into that program, I wanted to make a couple of quick technical announcements. After the presentation, we will be holding a question and answer session. Now, in order to stop a lot of cross chatter on microphones, you can enter your questions into either the Q&A module or the chat module that are located at the bottom of your Zoom screens. You can do this at any point during the presentation. It doesn't have to be during the Q&A portion, and we will get to questions in the order received. I also want to take a moment to recognize the branches with the most registered members for this particular happy hour. So that's the Atlanta branch, the Central Florida branch, as well as the Princeton branch of the English-speaking union. Now, to really start us off today, I'd like to welcome the president of the ESU Monmouth County branch, Ralph Windrum. Ralph, you're currently muted. If you'll just unmute yourself.
And I unmuted myself?
There, you're good, Ralph.
Okay, very fine. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to, good morning, I would say, to you in Hawaii. Good afternoon to those of you in New York. Good evening, a late evening in some cases, to those of you over in England and in Europe. We've heard the credentials of the speaker, Kathryn Aalto. She's a celebrated speaker, lecturer, naturalist, walker, a lot of adjectives that I could use to describe her. And she's going to be talking to us today on the subject of writing wild. The subject is quite interesting. She's going to help us see the world, the natural world, maybe with the help of the eyes of 25 other women. And as one of our colleagues said, Karen Blair, she said, well, this is perfect. It's Women's History Month. So we've got a perfect tie-in here. Kathryn is speaking to us from Devonshire, Exeter, lovely little town in Devonshire. Not too far, I think she can correct me, from where the Doc Martin TV show was filmed. A little further west of there, but that's same area. And she's going to be bringing us insights into gardening. She's a landscape designer. She has 2 master's degrees, one of which is in garden design. And that, I think, is quite a unique thing to hold. So we're going to be hearing about this in the context probably of English gardens, among other things. We really look forward to hearing from her. I'm going to introduce Kathryn Aalto immediately from Devonshire, England. Kathryn?
Thank you, Ralph, for that lovely introduction. It's nice to see you. Hello, everybody. I see about 92 of you around the world. It's nice to join you. Yes, I'm in lovely Exeter, England. I'm sure some of you have been here before. In the days when we can go walking, you had the opportunity to probably many of you have walked in this lovely country where we have an ancient network of public footpaths. So what I'm going to do right now is take you into the place where I live, but also the lives, literature, and landscapes and legacies of 25 women poets, ramblers, and mavericks who shape how we see the natural world. And it is wonderful to speak to you during Women's History Month. And I think this is an appropriate subject for that. And so I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes. It's going to be a lively talk, hopefully. And I really look forward to taking your questions. So feel free to ask those in the chat box, as Joshua mentioned. And then I'll be really looking forward to taking your questions. So let's go to this right here. So this is where I live. I live, as Ralph said, in Exeter, England. I moved here with my partner, who's a professor at the University of Exeter, in 2007 with our 3 kids. They were about 3, 6, and 9 at the time. And I was really sad to leave our beautiful farm in the Pacific Northwest. We had nesting bald eagles and a salmon spawning stream. It was a beautiful place. And I really thought, how am I going to raise my children in this country of England? I just didn't know. It looks like Teletubby land. This is a flat part here. But the second day in moving here, I discovered footpaths. I came across a book on walking, and my world changed. I don't feel like I need to have a farm anymore. We live on a ridge here in Exeter, but I discovered the ancient network of public footpaths. So I could walk outside my door all the way up to the Hebrides in Scotland if I wanted. But this is just to give you a sense of where I live. And this is a 16th century ship canal bridge where I walk daily. I'd like to tell you a little bit about where my book, Writing Wild, originated. It started because I was reading an article that Outside Magazine tweeted in a couple years ago, and it was called something like 25 books all well-read explorers should read. And I was curious about that, so I looked through the article, and I first noticed the date. It was published in 2003, so I thought, it's a bit dated, about 15 years old. And then I noticed that 22 out of the 25 books were by white guys. And, I don't have anything against white men, but I said, there are more voices. I said I could write something better or more inclusive is what I said. So the poor social media person put me in touch with the editor at Outside Magazine. And a couple months later, my piece was featured. And it got a lot of traction. It kind of went ballistic on social media. And so my publisher wrote, Timber Press is my publisher. My previous book with them was The Natural World of Winnie the Pooh. And a walk through the forest that inspired the 100-Acre Wood. So everything I do has to do with walking. I said, no, I'm not writing a book. Would you like me to? And sure enough, I did. And a couple years later, Writing Wild came out. So this came out last June, and I'm very pleased with it. I look at I take people up Scafell Pike in England. I go in canoeing in Cooperstown, New York. So I explore 25 voices of women who have written over the last 200 years, but I also have side paths at the end of most chapters, introducing people to other writers who write within that subject area. So in total, there are about 75 women that I mentioned. So would you like to go into the first chapter? Well, why don't we? Let's take a walk. I love taking a walk with you. So let's go to the opening chapter and take a walk up Scafell Pike, which is where I begin the book. Our journey begins in Wasdale, one of the most remote valleys in England's Lake District. In the pink pre-dawn light of midsummer, I set out on a narrow lane lined in dry stone walls, overflowing in fragrant wild honeysuckle and mustard lichen. I passed St. Olaf's, possibly England's smallest church, a stone structure set amid a grove of yews in ancient Viking fields. I lifted the latch on a path marked Scafell Pike, stepped through the gate, and hear the metallic clink break the morning silence. I cross a pasture toward a wooden bridge and onto a narrow ascending gravel trail. The way is up, but Scafell Pike, the peak I'm aiming for and England's tallest, is hidden for the moment by Goat Crag. I walk through Bracken Close, then rise along the rocky cascades of Lingmel Gill, and higher through alpine meadows of purple sassafrage. and carpets of moss along the brown tongue. Above me is Black Crag, a peak shorter than my destination. And I stop here to appreciate the pleasures of total silence. When I begin hiking again, I can hear my breath and my feet crunching in the gravel. Somewhere in the clear air above me, a ring ouzel calls, pauses, then sings a warbled song that sounds like marbles in hand. An hour passes, 1,500 feet climbed. Higher up at Lingmel Col, the saddle between Broad Crag and Scafell Pike. Herdwick sheep rest in boulder shadows, where they leave tufts of black and white wool and parsley fern. Above me, the sharp ping, ping, ping of a buzzard against the fingernail moon. The sun is rising and soon it will be hot. My legs are strong and I travel light. I don't mean to overtake two sets of highly kitted men, but I do, and I wink at them. I reach a large debris field of scree and shattered rock and look for cairns to lead me in the final steep climb. I leap across rocks and boulders. There are some final steps onto a platform, and I'm finally standing at the 3,209-foot summit. For a little while before less early risers make their way up, I am alone on one of the world's most rapturous stages. I take a deep breath, surrounded by a study in blues. Dark blue lakes, indigo mountain shadows, robin egg sky. It's 7 in the morning and the sun is spreading golden light into these blue hues. I see Helvellyn and Skiddaw and can just make out the Mourne Mountains across the Irish Sea and Snowdonia in Wales to the south. Somewhere in the hills below me is Grasmere, the home of England's most famous poet. Here on top of Scafell Pike, it's easy to understand why few landscapes are more steeped in literary history than this. It's a place celebrated over 200 years ago by the enraptured band of brothers known as the Lake Poets, Robert Southey, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and William Wordsworth, who all walked and wrote among these hills and vales. In their landmark 1798 lyrical ballads, Wordsworth and Coleridge sought to overturn the pompous epic poetry that came before them. They were their generation's Sex Pistols and Dead Kennedys, and this was poetry's punk moment. Old subjects were thrown out, sensations were celebrated. In ordinary language and in folk ballad form, these poets celebrated their own memories, their own emotions, and their own experiences in nature. Their work represents the start of what is known as English Romanticism, the artistic celebration of the individual, nature, and the past that extended from the late 1700s to the early 1800s. It was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the new faith in reason, science, and mathematics embodied by the Enlightenment. Romantics sought a return to individual experiences like awe, horror, and fear, as a way to cultivate mystery and wonder in an increasingly mechanistic society. In simple terms, you could say that a romantic preferred to wake up to a cockerel than a clock. Squinting in the direction of Grasmere, I think of Glencoyne Bay near Ullswater, where Wordsworth and his younger sister Dorothy often walked together. I haven't climbed all this way to celebrate him. 170 years after his death, he still has his fame, and rightly so. Instead, I am thinking of Dorothy. That's a buzzard. Right. So that's the opening of Riding Wild. When I take people into the Lake District, this iconic landscape in northern England. And I start there for a number of reasons. Well, Dorothy Wordsworth is one of the very first women to write really about the natural world and her ascent of Scafell Pike. She was born in 1771. She was the younger sister of William Wordsworth. She had all of the Wordsworth children had a tragic childhood. Their parents died when she was 10, and she was sent away to an aunt's house or cousins of her mother's in Yorkshire. And she didn't see her brothers again. She had 4 brothers for 10 years, even though they lived 100 miles away. And she she had an unusual, well, happy childhood, really, when she was with her cousins. But she missed her family. She missed her mother and father, of course. So when she met up with her brother William Wordsworth again, they discovered that they had a really similar poetic sensibility, and they loved walking. She was the kind of person who could see the sun on a bright sunny day, and she could see, when she saw the sea for the first time, she cried. She really had all these traits of the romantics. But and she and her brother did go on a walk around Glencoyne Bay, where they came across in almost this time, April 2nd, I think, 1803, they came across a bank of wild daffodils, and she was so moved by it that she went back to their cottage, Dove Cottage, and she wrote about it, just a few lines. But this journal was kept open, and her brother nicked a few of her passages from that and used it in what is arguably the most famous poem in the English language, Daffodils. And I quote Wordsworth's version and Dorothy's version. And it's an indication of, well, these days she would get more credit, wouldn't she? So, but it shows her story is an interesting portrait of where we've been as female nature writers and where we've come. Not just nature writers, but women's roles and how much freedom that we had. So if you look at Dorothy, she didn't have access to a university like her brother did. So William went to Cambridge. Women then could not walk on their own. So she used to get reprimanding letters from relatives saying, "Why are you walking at midnight under moonlight?" So we would suffer from reputational anxiety if we walked alone, as if we were, sexually promiscuous by walking alone and enjoying our time in the natural world. So not only could we not walk alone, but we didn't have access to education in a way. And I don't, many people believe that Dorothy was a stronger poet than her brother, looking at some of the things that she wrote. But she also wrote about her 1818 ascent of Scawfell Pike. And William also took that account and he used it in a book about walking in the Lake District, and he never gave his sister credit. So I don't think Dorothy would have minded, but we can mind for her 200 years later, more than 200 years later. So I take people into Dorothy's home. This is Dove Cottage that she shared with William Wordsworth and his wife and children. They later moved on to Rydal Mount in Grasmere. But a peek into the gardens here shows the way she designed it, which was with native dandelions and wild strawberries and foxgloves that she gathered from her walks in the Lake District. So that's a little bit about Dorothy Wordsworth. But also, how about if we go to your neck of the woods? So we pretend that we're flying over the pond back to New York. The next person I write about is Susan Fenimore Cooper. The name of Fenimore Cooper might ring a bell. She was the daughter of James Fenimore Cooper. And like Dorothy Wordsworth, she had strong men in her life. That her father prevented her from getting married, so she never had a partner or husband and children. So she ended up being the executor of her father's estate. But something also remarkable is also remarkable about her writing. She is America's first nature writer. A lot of people think, well, Henry David Thoreau wrote Walden in 1854, right? Wasn't he America's first nature writer? Well, a lot of people like to call him the father of American environmentalism. But Rural Hours was published in 1850, 4 years before he wrote Walden. And actually, he knew about it. He read it. Now look at this slide here. You can see Rural Hours by a lady. So women, we couldn't use our first names. And everyone knows that anonymous was always a woman. So Susan Fenimore Cooper wrote Rural Hours. They were kind of written in a diary form, following seasons. And it was really 2 years condensed into one. And they were her observations on life in Cooperstown. And that included the natural world as well as sort of cultural life. But she's important because she puts forth the very first land ethic in the United States. She wrote about her neighbors, whom she felt, people in her community, whom she felt might benefit if they could learn to appreciate trees for just being trees rather than cutting them down and creating furniture out of them. And she, so there are lots of passages that are lyrical about robins coming in and lots of flora and fauna that she notices, but really interesting thoughts too about how we should be treating the land as new people in this country. It was no longer a frontier, or a wilderness. It was an area that had been settled for a while, but Susan Fenimore Cooper is really important for that reason. Now, a lot of people might say, well, why is Thoreau more prominent? We could also, as women, we could not use the word I, very simple first person singular. So her Rural Hours is written in a slightly interesting way. I don't particularly like the style because it sounds like, well, where is Susan Fenimore Cooper? She talks about we, and it's quite formal. But Henry David Thoreau wrote in a very zesty first person presence. He is right in his narrative. So you could say that men had the privilege of being able to use the first person. And that's not something I really thought too much about before I studied Susan Fenimore Cooper and then brought out my books on Thoreau. And I realized, actually, I teach the art of the personal essay, and I had been quite immersed in that at the time. And I thought, well, one of the traits of the personal essay is being present on the page, first person. So, and women could not really have that. So not only could we did not have access to education, we couldn't use the first person pronoun I. It was also considered having kind of a stench of ego if you used the first person, for women especially. So she would have been accused of having, women were accused of being dame scribblers, and it was improper for women to want to be writers. Very few women made their living in this way. And also, we couldn't really walk alone. She was always with a companion. Why isn't she as well known now as Thoreau? Well, she's well known in academic circles for sure. And I really hope Writing Wild gives her more general readership access to her and her importance. So I was really, really proud to include Dorothy Wordsworth and Susan Fenimore Cooper. And of course, just like I take people up Scawfell Pike, I had a friend take me all around Cooperstown. I wanted people to really get a sense of what it felt like to be Susan Fenimore Cooper. As much as I could. I was hoping that there was a mist this morning, and the mist lifted. And well, anyway, if you're interested, you could read more about it in Writing Wild. So I was really, really happy to tell more people about Susan Fenimore Cooper. Now, last year at this time, last Women's History Month, I was deeply honored to write one of the big features for Smithsonian Magazine on someone who really was a gun-toting, trouser-wearing, maverick named Gene Stratton Porter. Now you might look at that name and say, well, Gene Stratton Porter, wasn't she a man? Well, I would think that would be a man. Well, it wasn't. Gene Stratton Porter was Geneva, and she lived in Geneva, Indiana. So I traveled to Indiana and to the Limberlost. So the Limberlost during her time was 13,000 acres of swamp and hardwood forest. And she did a lot of her research there. She wrote more than 26, I think 28 books on slightly sappy nature novels with actually very strong heroines, female heroines, and nature books. I am a big fan of her work. She wrote, one of my favorite books is actually on moths. So she was known as the bird lady of the Limberlost, and she said everything in the Limberlost now. And when she lived there, it was, the story of the Limberlost is it was drained and deforested, and all the beautiful hardwoods were sent up to Michigan and made into furniture. But she captured this area before it was tamed and shorn, as she said. And so reading those books, and some of you listening, I bet, I'm giving you an invitation right now. If you have relatives who've given you books from the 1900s to 1920s, it's possible that you might have some of her books. She sold 55 million books in her lifetime. She was incredibly important because she was many of her books were made into films. She was the first photographer, male or female, I'm gonna go back to this slide, first photographer, male or female, to capture birds on film that weren't live birds. So before her, men would shoot, stuff, and pose birds. So imagine, when I was in the Limberlost, and I was led around by a wonderful naturalist. It was easy for me to just whip out my smart Android phone and take pictures of birds and put on the voice recording of the songs. But imagine having to haul 100 pounds of heavy camera equipment into a swamp with a horse and buggy, and your horse takes off or backs you into the water, and then having to bring a gun in and help defend yourself from snakes. So she would take like a week to get a particular shots. So I loved being in Indianapolis and going to the Limberlost as well, and looking at and researching her life. She was an absolutely amazing woman. She was also someone who led a protest, really, against the slaughter of songbirds for their plumage, for hats that women used to wear. I mean, imagine back in that era, people would wear incredibly fancy hats, some with whole birds in them. And so she was prominent in raising consciousness of the impact of slaughtering birds for women's fashion. She was just prominent for so many reasons. So I want to invite everybody to go poke around your attics and look in your bookshelves. You might have a first edition of some of her books, and do go read them. They are just absolutely fantastic. I tend to like her nature profiles, less her sappy novels, but she was the J.K. Rowling of 100 years ago, and for very good reason. And she knew the Roosevelts, and when she died in 1924 in a car accident in Bel Air, she was mourned across the nation. I should also say she was the first woman to own a film production studio in Hollywood. And that's because she wanted control over how her books were made into films. So, and also, if you want to know more about her, you can look up Smithsonian Magazine. I wrote about 5,000 words about her there. My chapter on her for Writing Wild is about 2,000. So you get more in the Smithsonian piece. Wonderful books. At the same time, you know, there's Mary Austin, who also, there are a couple parallels with Gene Stratton Porter and Mary Austin. So Mary Austin is important because she wrote The Land of Little Rain in 1903. And just as Gene Stratton Porter celebrated a disappearing landscape, the story of the Midwest, called the Limberlost, Mary Austin celebrated the Owens River Valley before it was drained of its water as well for the city of Los Angeles. So if you're a fan of Chinatown like I am, go watch Chinatown. That tells the story of where the water came from. And so Mary Austin captured that in The Land of Little Rain. It's a thin, lyrical, quite vivid visual book about the indigenous people of the Owens River Valley and the flora and fauna and of the high desert. But the other interesting thing about Mary Austin, well, she had quite an amazing life. She was a pioneering science fiction writer. She was a proponent of indigenous rights, of the indigenous people's rights. She was an early feminist writer as well. And she believed that women should be valued for their intelligence, not just sort of these feminine qualities that some feminists would say that, you know, women should be admired for. And she was a who's who of the modernist era. She knew Ansel Adams and Georgia O'Keeffe and Emma Goldman and the Roosevelts and lots of writers. She had a really, really, really tough life, I have to say. And I describe it in Writing Wild, but she was constantly getting her husband out of debt on a teacher's salary. They also had a child with Down syndrome, unfortunately. And they ended up putting the child in an institution, and she divorced her husband and became, like I said, this who's who. There's a wonderful picture of her sitting on a beach in Carmel with Jack London. But I have to say, most mountains and landscape features in the United States are named after men, especially if you think about the Sierra Nevadas. They're named after soldiers and presidents and male scientists and geologists and military leaders. But there's one peak, 14,000 feet, and it's called Mount Mary Austin. The ironic thing is that it overlooks her former hometown called Independence. So I think it's a bit ironic that women can now climb that mountain and look out over a place called Independence, California. So Mary Austin is quite a remarkable person in so many ways. Now, Americans might not be so familiar with this next person named Nan Shepherd. Nan Shepherd is also important because she is featured on the most beautiful currency I've ever set my eyes on. It's the Scottish £5 note. So she is a nature writer, but she's also a modern Scottish novelist. But she's really celebrated today for her important book called The Living Mountain. And the story behind it is really interesting. So The Living Mountain is a Buddhist-inspired pilgrimage into the Cairngorm Mountains, which is a beautiful range of mountains northwest of Aberdeen, Scotland. So of course, I take the readers into the mountains of the Cairngorm Mountains. So she is one of the most celebrated writers of mountaineering literature now, but not in the way you might think. She didn't celebrate, a fatalist sense and conquests of mountains. She celebrated being in the mountain. So The Living Mountain is really it's a really sensual book about the recesses of mountains and waking up in mountains and walking like you're with a friend in the mountains, and not so much, having a conquest of the mountains. A beautiful book, only 30,000 words. Now there's a story behind that, of course. So she wrote this book between the wars. And for reasons, well, I know the reason. Buy my book, and you'll find the reason. It's the reason. The reason, there's a mystery behind The Living Mountain, and the mystery is it wasn't published until 1977. So she put it in a drawer in Aberdeen, Scotland, where she lived in her house, and she did not take it out of the drawer for not 6 months, not 6 years, not a decade, but almost 40 years. So why is that? Well, was it because she had a thyroid condition? Some people think. No. Was it because there was a paper shortage? Possibly. Well, I'll tell you. The reason is because she was scared of what the male-dominated mountaineering community would think of such a sensual book. And I don't mean sexual, I mean a sensual book about vision and hearing and just being in the mountain. It's a shimmering account that's very, very distinct from male mountaineering literature. So I skewer the person who said a few nasty things about her recently. But he was alive when I wrote the book, and he's since died. But I have a feeling he was quite a maverick himself. He wouldn't mind it having someone counter some of his opinions. But anyway, I really enjoyed every single one of these women that I wrote about. But Nan Shepherd is quite different, and she is now, as a nature writer, celebrated on the 5-pound note. So I think that's really important. You have women who are dislodging some of the stereotypically male-dominated places, mountains, money, film production studios, and so forth. So it was a joy to walk in the mountains and bring it alive to the readers, as well. So when I was at Berkeley in the early 1988 to 1992, I took a class in nature writing from someone I profile in the book called Carolyn Merchant. She's one of the leading environmental historians. And in our syllabus, it was a student class. In all the nature writing that I read at that time that was even available to me, really, it was it didn't have too many Native American voices and diverse voices. So in a way, Writing Wild is a book I wish I had when I was in my formative coming of age years in the early 1990s. So one woman that women that I want to celebrate are diverse voices, Native Americans, African American voices as well. So many of you, I'm sure, know this book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I was honored to go for a walk with her as well. I was taking part in the Environmental Literature Institute at the Phillips Exeter Academy, and she was our keynote speaker and took us on a walk. So just hearing her speak about how ancient ways of knowing can be combined with modern scientific learning. She's a professor of botany in New York State, but she's also a Native American as well. So her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, braids those two things. Ancient ways of knowing, they don't need to be exclusive of each other. They can be combined together. I also wanted to include someone named Carolyn Finney, who was also a colleague of Carolyn Merchant in the Berkeley department. What makes Carolyn Finney different? She's not a nature writer, but what I was trying to do is bring, as I mentioned, a chorus of diverse voices in. Carolyn Finney wrote a book called Black Faces, White Spaces. And it's about the representation of African Americans in the environmental movement and the use of outdoor space as well. Now, every single woman changed me, I have to say. Many of them I had known before through just decades of studying nature writing and teaching American literature of nature and place. But this book is quite recent, and I really deeply reflected on my privilege being a white woman just by the color of my skin, and understanding how disproportionately white folks have been represented in environmental movements than uh, African Americans and Black and brown people, which was really, I did not ever think of the environmental being an environmentalist in that way. So one of the things about writing this book is writing anything is that you're deeply changed. And I get letters all the time from people who've read it, and they're the number of side paths that I provide, that is, the additional reading I provide, will change people as well. And so I include just many voices that are like Carolyn Finney. So although she's not a nature writer per se, she does bookend Black faces, white spaces with a personal narrative. It's really about, for me, bringing as multifaceted, as many voices as possible to showcase a multifaceted genre by women. Now, I end the book with Elizabeth Rush. Of course, I include many voices, other women as well, Vita Sackville-West and Rachel Carson and Gretel Ehrlich and Laurette Savoy, Camille Dungy, lots of voices. But I do end with Elizabeth Rush. And her book, Rising, arrived the last week in August of 2018. And that was the week of the Carr Fire in Northern California. And my brother, with his wife and 3 children, barely made it out of their house in the mountains. Their house burned down the week I got Rising. And I say in the book, waters rising, seas rising, and houses burning down. It was Rising is the story of the dispatches from the New American Shore. So Elizabeth Rush really is quite a counterpoint to Dorothy Wordsworth. She's in her 30s. She teaches at Brown University, where my son is finishing up right now. She is quite, if you think about the how far women have come, Elizabeth Rush has a university degree. She was walking solo without men to chaperone her in her research. Her name is on the book. And like Henry David Thoreau and many authors since, of course, she is able to put her name, first person singular. She is present in the narrative, and she's writing about something that Dorothy Wordsworth would never have imagined, which is climate change. So Elizabeth Rush is really the epitome of where we've come, which is a wonderful place to be for Women's History Month, to celebrate all these people. So yes, I am, as Ralph said, I am a garden historian. I have a master's in garden history and a diploma in garden design. Another one in narrative nonfiction. But I had to take you to Vita Sackville-West's place. Sissinghurst Castle Garden is one of the most famous gardens and influential gardens in the world. And she was well known for her writing in a newspaper, but on gardens and plant histories and so forth. But she was also she had won 2 very important awards in poetry. So she wrote in a Georgic fashion about the a Kent landscape. And I think, Vita Sackville-West wasn't in a single anthology when I was learning about nature writing. And so she's absolutely worth reading. She beautifully celebrates the Kent landscape. And of course, if you know much about Vita Sackville-West, she was a gender-bending Sapphic rebel. She had an unusual marriage and lived life on her own terms, as did her husband. So a really important person, for me. So all of these women were important. So if you take a look here, from Dorothy Wordsworth to Elizabeth Rush, all very diverse women. I include Cli-Fi writers. Sachi Lloyd is a climate change fiction writer. I include Rebecca Solnit, Native American writers, and people who are humorous too. Nature writing can be accused of feeling like you're at a funeral, that it's not often very humorous, but there's Elena Passarello I include in there as well, and Sachi Lloyd, who writes Cli-Fi, as I mentioned, are both very funny. So lots of really, really interesting voices. But I thought I would end with America's favorite poet, best-selling poet, Mary Oliver. And of course, I spent a weekend out on Cape Cod, in your neck of the woods, and learning about here on this trail. I was looking for her pencils. She had a habit, a very strong morning constitution of walking every morning. That's when her best ideas come, morning and walking. Sounds good to me. But she used to keep pencils everywhere, so no idea would go unrecorded. And so here I'm peeking, looking under rocks, searching for a Mary Oliver pencil, which I would have treasured. But I never found one. But anyway, I thought I could leave you with a poem. We were fortunate to get permission to use 3 poems: Wild Geese, The Summer Day, and Blackwater Pond, at Blackwater Pond. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. It's called The Summer Day by Mary Oliver. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? That's a question for you all. Thank you very much. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Kathryn, for that wonderful introduction to so many exceptional women. And I'm not alone in that kind of estimation, because we've already had some questions that have shown up during the presentation. So I'm just going to jump right into them. The first is from Gloria Norris in our Atlanta branch, who asks, when did the attitude toward lady writers change so that they could use I and be acknowledged as writers, walk alone in the woods, etc.?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Walking alone in the woods. Well, I would say probably Jane Austen writes about it, I know. I think she probably tried to break away herself. But I know for sure Mary Austen, 1903, was doing it. She was out in the high desert alone. I suspect there were other women. I mean, there are mountaineering women in Wales who climbed Snowdonia before 1800, but they were outliers. That was very unusual. And I know of an account of 2 women walking happily down Snowdonia in a pair, I think 2 sisters or 2 girlfriends. So there was that, but it was rare. I think much more common, around the turn of the century. Josh, what was the second part? Was it?
Oh, the second part was the use of I as in acknowledged as writers. I actually want to, there's a second question of this, and I'll tie in with it so we can kind of get them both together. Uh, from Hannah Lord Noble by saying by the mid 1800s there were many women who made their living by writing in very popular fiction. So successful were these women that Hawthorne, I believe they mean Nathaniel Hawthorne, complained about all these scribbling women. Um, that paired up with a question from Gloria Norris on when did the attitude towards lady writers change so that they could use I.
Okay, there are two questions there. Yeah. So I'm an essayist, and so when did women write essays is different than when did women write fiction, and when did women start using their names. So all of that did change in the sort of, I think 1860 to 1890 or so. And I do know that Susan Fenimore Cooper was able to, in later editions of Rural Hours, she wrote, her name was on the cover. So, and everyone knew it was her anyway. So anyway, if you look at, where is it? Cather. I'm forgetting her first name. Willa Cather, of course, wrote incredible books as well about women in the Midwest. My Antonia is one of them, but that was a little bit later, wasn't it? I would say that women, I don't know when they completely shook off that reputation of being dame scribblers. But yeah, I do know about Nathaniel Hawthorne and, the women, his wife and various women in that transcendentalist group too were early proponents. And I don't quite know exactly when it was, permissible for women to actually walk alone without, being in the company of men. But again, women were doing it. There were early mountain climbers but I'm not quite sure when it completely changed, to be honest. I don't know the exact decade.
So this question from Dave Grissett from our New Orleans branch, who asks, among all your walks, have you hiked the Appalachian Trail? And if so, your thoughts?
Oh, no, I have not hiked the Appalachian Trail. I've hiked all around the Pacific Northwest and California, where I'm from. One of my friends did, I have to say, and she brought her 4 kids along with her, and her husband joined her on occasion. She also did the coast to coast path, and she's done everything. She's amazing. The coast. So I have done. I have walked across the country, which is England. So I've walked. My family and I walked the coast to coast path from St. Bees to Robin Hood's Bay. It's about 192 miles. I'm working on the Thames River path right now. I'm also working on the Southwest Coast path. I'm about 150 miles into that, which goes from Minehead in Somerset all the way around the Southwest in England. I kind of like walking here in England because we don't have charismatic megafauna to eat you. So, there are no grizzlies, there are no mountain lions or anything here. It's quite, and I actually feel quite safe as a woman walking here. We don't have a gun culture either, so I feel safe, to be honest, perfectly frank. Yeah, I feel quite safe here. So next question. Go ahead, Josh.
So M. Wang asks, is Dorothy Wordsworth now recognized as comparable to her brother?
In some circles, she is. Yeah, some people think that she did write. Well, she didn't. She wasn't as prolific as he was. She was never the poet laureate. But if you look in her letters and her travel diaries, she was a diarist and a letter writer, and a poet. But she didn't ascribe or she didn't want to be. she didn't aim to be an author, but many people think that her descriptions and her poetic sensibility is even more acute and better than her brother's. He worked and reworked a lot of his like the prelude, and so he but in terms of insights, a lot of people think that in academia think that Dorothy was a little bit more original. So let's give her credit.
So our next question is from Donald Patillo from the Atlanta branch, who asks, is Pearl S. Buck outside the scope of your writing interests?
No, not outside of my writing interests, but I wouldn't call her exactly a classic nature writer, to be honest. Not exactly classic. Although I did consider it. I did consider her work. So.
So another question from Dave Grissett from our New Orleans branch, who asks, as a garden designer, what is the demand for formal stylized gardens versus well-planned but layered to look random gardens in the USA and England currently?
Boy, that's a good question. Well, the trends in garden design. Well, here in England, we love if you look at the Chelsea Flower Show, for example, when we have it, there's a big trend right now toward meadows, the recreation of meadows. And you often get, and I have to admit, this is the way I enjoy designing this way, although I design based on what clients want, which is there's a sense of formality, up against the wild. I love that combination, that idea of static, evergreen, architectural boxwoods, for example, or yews, right up against, a quote of a meadow or some wonderful grasses. I love the dynamism and that tension between those two. So meadows are a very big thing here right now, and especially we've lost 90% of our meadows in 90 years or so, native wild meadows here in England. So we're all, I live in Exeter here. It's called a, wild city where people are converting places over to, wildflower meadows. Now, so England fits in the bottom half of my home state of California. So I know English gardening fairly well. But the United States, I can't really comment on the trends there, because I think they differ. It's such a big country, and there's so many different climate zones as well. I know I have a friend, Benjamin Vogt in Nebraska, who is all about his what he does. His motto is prairie up, prairie up. And so it's really important to create biodiverse pollinator gardens. So he's in the prairie. He's concerned about recreating the prairie. So I think that we need to think about gardening in terms of carbon sinks and growing our own veg, and using using our own spaces to link up with other gardens as well. That we're part of a whole, aren't we? So yeah, those kind of the trends here in England. Can't comment too much on the US, unfortunately.
So our final question isn't really a question, but from Pauline Perkins, who says, as a child, I had read Girl of the Limberlost. I remember almost nothing about it because it was probably more than 70 years ago, and I got it from my local library in Birmingham. But just a comment there that someone did read one of Gene Stratton Porter's books.
Sorry, what was the last part?
Oh, that someone did read one of Gene Stratton Porter's books, Girl of the Limberlost, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I encourage everybody to go dig around your attic and find out, and if you've inherited books from 100 years ago, it would be lovely if you came across the first edition or not, or any edition of her books. Yeah. So there we go.
Excellent. So now I'm going to introduce the executive director of the English Speaking Union, Karen Karpovich, just to say the last final words. Oops, there she is. Karen,
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much, Kathryn. I also wanted to mention your book is absolutely beautiful, and it's beautifully designed, and your illustrators did a phenomenal job. You know, I just wanted to mention that because I think it's a beautiful, beautiful design book in terms of the writers and the poetry and the writing, but also the look of it. So I do suggest everyone get a copy because it's in our day of ebooks, and I'm a big ebook person, but it's a beautiful book to own. And
Thank you. You know, the story behind that is that all right if I tell you a little bit about the designer?
I was going to ask that question, but I waited. No, finish, please.
Yeah. So I was given 7 designers to choose from, 6 or 7. And they were, I think, maybe put in order of the publisher's preference. I don't know. But I was able to, I looked at them all, but I was drawn to the very first one. And Gisela Goppel is a German illustrator, and she has a beautiful elegance and a way of capturing the emotion of a woman, or of any male or female, sorry. But for my book, the women, in just a few brush strokes. And we were limited. I mean, the outside of the book, as you said, she did the outside as well. Isn't that gorgeous? Is color, but the inside only uses, oh, look at this image of beautiful image of Mary Oliver. It's just classic elegance, beautiful. So I'm glad that she was available, but she was my first choice. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that because it's beautiful. And you know, you have my favorite Mary Oliver poem in here, which is Wild Geese. And the definitive first line for a woman's poem, which is, "You don't have to be good," which that's one of the great lines of all poetry. I want to thank you again, and I hope we get an opportunity for you to come back and do this again, because there's so much more content in here that we could talk about for hours. So please come back, and maybe we also do our Evelyn Wrench speakers, and maybe you can come to New York and come to the United States and visit some of our branches.
I would love that. I'm usually an in-person speaker, but I'm sure it will resume at some point. I've had my vaccine. I'm ready to travel when we can safely. But it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah.
And we are thinking about, resuming a lot of our in-person events and coming into some of our branch communities, which are quite beautiful, that you would probably enjoy going to.
I would love that.
Anyway, Ralph, I want to thank you, Ralph Windrum from Monmouth, for connecting us with Kathryn. It was very enjoyable. And I just wanted to mention the fact that I want to thank our branches who curate these programs, and also the committee headed by Karen Blair Brand and Josh Capel, who put these events together, which are quite beautiful. I wanted to mention too the fact that we are a membership organization, and we're looking. And if you're not a member, there is an opportunity to become a member when you fill out our survey, and we'd love to have you and as part of our community. And then finally, continuing in the theme of poetry, March 24th is World Poetry Day, and that's our next event, and that's going to be hosted by a gentleman named David Hassler, and he's from the Wicks Poetry Center, and we're going to continue on our theme of poetry. So thank you again, and join us again on the 24th. I think that begins at 5 o'clock Eastern time. So you'll be sent emails on that. Please register. And again, thank you, Kathryn, very much.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I know.